What if the answers we've been seeking weren't lost to time, but quietly written down and buried, waiting for us to listen? History is supposed to leave footprints. We imagine the past as something that lives in archives, carved in stone, or filmed in grainy reels. But sometimes the most enduring truths are written in ink, tucked inside books that were never meant to be found. This is a story about 10 such books. Diaries, journals, scraps of memory left behind by people who witnessed something too big, too strange, or too dangerous to be believed. Some knew they would never live to tell their stories out loud. Others feared what might happen if they did. And so they wrote. A lieutenant trapped in the Arctic, his ship locked in ice, scribbling the truth as his body slowly shut down. A maid who vanished in the Russian Revolution, her identity erased, until her diary revealed the truth about the Romanovs' final night. A confession written by a dying man who may have been the most infamous killer in history. A child's kidnapping solved not in court, but in a forgotten attic. A leap from a plane into a stormy sky that left behind no man, only a notebook. A hike through snow that ended in chaos and silence until one half-frozen page was found. A missing plane whose last calculations pointed somewhere we hadn't thought to look. 10 mysteries, 10 diaries, 10 moments when someone, against all odds, wrote the truth and hoped the future would care. But this is not a story about conspiracies. This is a story about memory. How fragile it is, how often it is buried, and how it can survive even when no one is left to speak it. What you're about to hear is a journey through forgotten voices. Some have already changed the way we understand the past. Others are still being debated. But each entry, each page, each word written in the margins of history asks the same quiet question. What if the dead were always trying to tell us something? We begin not with a murder or a disappearance, but with a voyage, a journey into ice, into silence, into a place where death was not swift, but slow, creeping, and cold. The men of the Franklin expedition didn't vanish all at once. They wrote as they died. And in 2014, the ice gave up their words. Let's go back to 1845, to the edge of the known world, where 2 ships vanished into Arctic fog, and a single diary waited more than 150 years to speak again. It started with silence. July 1845, 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, slipped into the Arctic with 129 men aboard, chasing the promise of the Northwest Passage. They were well provisioned, well prepared, and led by Sir John Franklin, a veteran explorer. After a final sighting in Baffin Bay by whalers, they were never seen alive again. For more than a century and a half, the fate of the Franklin expedition haunted historians. Bones were found scattered across the ice. A single note recovered in 1859 told of Franklin's death and the crew's attempt to march south. Other clues hinted at scurvy, starvation, and something darker, cannibalism, madness. But no one knew why the ships had been abandoned. They were intact, fully stocked, anchored in place. Why walk into certain death? 2. Then, in 2014, a hunting party stumbled upon something buried deep in permafrost near King William Island. A leather-bound book wrapped in oilskin, protected by layers of ice and time. It was the diary of Lieutenant Henry Le Vesconte. He had been aboard the Erebus. The entries began in April 1846 and ended in May 1848, just weeks before the crew made their fatal march. Much of the text was damaged, the handwriting fading into frost-stained paper, but enough remained to piece together the final days. What he described was not a sudden disaster, but a slow unraveling. Lead poisoning. Symptoms were everywhere: trembling hands, delirium, memory loss. Men began coughing blood. What Le Vesconte believed was a lung infection sweeping through the cramped quarters, possibly tuberculosis or pneumonia. Franklin died in 1847, the sickness claiming him in the dead of Arctic winter. But the ships stayed frozen in place. For 3 years, the ice refused to release them. As supplies dwindled, the officers made a horrifying discovery. The ship's water filtration systems had been leaching lead from the pipes. Every drop they drank was poisoning them further. They hadn't abandoned the ships because of ice. They left to escape their own slow murder. Le Vescont's final entries are haunting. His handwriting disintegrates into chaos. Sentences trail off, thoughts repeat. But one line stands out, dated May 14, 1848. We know now what has killed us. The question is whether anyone will ever know we knew. He knew he was dying, but he hoped somehow the truth would be found. And it was. The diary solved the central riddles, the cause of death, the reason for abandonment, the disease that swept through the crew. It told us that they had known, that this was not ignorance or panic, but a conscious choice to walk away from the ships, because to stay was to die slower. Today, Le Vescont's diary rests in the Canadian Museum of History. He died in the Arctic, believing his words would vanish with him, but they didn't. His testimony endured, beneath ice, beneath snow, beneath years of silence. When it was uncovered, the world saw not just the fate of an expedition, but the resilience of one man's voice, scribbled in the cold, refusing to be forgotten. How many other truths lie frozen beneath the surface, waiting for the thaw? What if history's most famous murder wasn't fully witnessed by any of the killers, but by someone hidden behind a door? Yekaterinburg, Russia, July 17, 1918. In a dark basement of the Ipatiev house, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and several loyal attendants were executed by Bolshevik guards. Bullets echoed through the cellar, sealing the fate of the Romanov dynasty and igniting a century of speculation. The bodies weren't found for decades. The details were murky. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some said the children screamed. Others claimed it was quick. Rumors swirled for generations that one daughter, Anastasia, had escaped, that some members of the family had survived. No proof, no closure. Until 2007, when a man cleaning out his grandmother's apartment in Perm made an astonishing discovery: a small box, sealed tight. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed cloth, was a diary. The handwriting was old but deliberate. The signature at the back read, Anna Demidova. History had long recorded Demidova as one of the Romanovs' murdered attendants. But the diary told a different story, one she had kept hidden for nearly 90 years. She had not died that night. She had lived, and she had watched. Her words were quiet, precise. She wrote of being sent upstairs just before the executions began. A routine errand, a moment of chance. Then, gunfire. From the upstairs hallway, she hid in a closet. She did not flee. She did not scream. She listened. She heard the chaos, the yelling, the second rounds of gunfire as executioners returned again and again to finish what the bullets hadn't. She heard one of them curse as he realized the bullets had ricocheted off jewels sewn into the royal daughter's clothing. A grotesque irony. The wealth they had sewn into their hems to protect them had deflected death, but only for minutes. She counted the bodies carried out. 11. The Tsar, the Tsarina, 5 children, the family doctor, 3 servants. The rumors were wrong. No one had escaped. She had seen them all. Demidova's diary told more than what happened. It told why she stayed silent. "They would kill me," she wrote, "or they would call me a liar and a monarchist. Either way, I would not survive the truth." So she vanished, changed her name, married quietly, lived an ordinary life. Even her children never knew. She wrote it down only when she was old, hiding the truth in ink and paper rather than her voice. Forensic analysts later verified the diary. Her handwriting matched old service records. Her descriptions aligned with autopsy reports that were only confirmed decades later. Her silence had been absolute. But her words, left behind in secret, brought a kind of ending to the Romanov mystery. Anna Demidova died in 1989. 2 years later, the Romanov remains were officially identified. She didn't live to see history acknowledge her truth. But the diary she left behind did what no revolution, no investigation, and no rumor ever could. It confirmed who lived, who died, and who stayed hidden. Sometimes the most powerful witness is the one who says nothing for a lifetime and writes it down for the dead instead. How many others have seen history unfold through a crack in the door and dared to leave a record for a world they never meant to face? What if the most infamous killer in history left a confession, and no one believed it? London, 1888. The Whitechapel district shrouded in fog, fear curling through its alleyways. 5 women murdered with surgical precision. The press named him Jack the Ripper. And for over a century, the question persisted. Who was he? Suspects came and went. Doctors, royals, butchers, painters. No one could say for certain. Then, in 1992, a battered leather diary surfaced in Liverpool, brought to a literary agent by a former scrap metal dealer. Its pages contained a chilling confession, written in ink dark as dried blood. The name inside, James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant who had died in 1889, poisoned, some claimed, by his wife. The diary detailed the murders, graphic, intimate, and laced with bitterness. But skepticism followed immediately. The handwriting didn't match Maybrick's known letters. The ink was old, but dating methods were inconclusive. Most experts called it a forgery until 2019. That year, researchers at Liverpool John Moores University used multispectral imaging to look beneath the surface. They found traces of erased writing that matched Maybrick's authenticated hand. A theory emerged. Someone, possibly his wife, Florence, had traced over the original diary to make it legible. The overwriting changed the script, but not the story. The entries weren't vague. The writer described details never publicized in newspapers, how the victims were positioned, mutilated, left in the cold. One passage referenced a woman murdered in Manchester months before the canonical Whitechapel murders began. Researchers tracked it down, a real case, long forgotten, with uncanny similarities. Then the diary stops. May 3, 1889, 8 days before Maybrick's death. "My own dear Bunny is making me pay," the final entry reads. "She knows the arsenic comes in my meat. I am too weak to stop her. This is justice." Florence Maybrick was convicted of poisoning her husband. For years, historians called it a miscarriage of justice. But if the diary is real, then she wasn't punishing an innocent man. She was ending the life of a serial killer. To this day, the debate continues. Some scholars dismiss the diary as a clever hoax. Others say it's the most compelling evidence ever found. But one thing is certain. The diary revealed things no hoaxer could have easily known. A murder not in the records, details buried in sealed police files, and the private despair of a man unraveling from the inside. Whether Maybrick was Jack the Ripper or not, the diary solved something else. It showed that whoever wrote it knew things only the killer could have known. And perhaps more hauntingly, it revealed that even monsters write things down, that even the most brutal hands can hold a pen, that the line between history and horror might lie in a forgotten notebook, passed through decades waiting to be read. What if the truth doesn't scream from rooftops, but whispers from the margins of a yellowed page? What if justice was carried out, but for the wrong man? New Jersey, 1932. The kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh, Jr., the toddler son of America's most celebrated aviator, shocked the nation. A ransom was paid. 2 months later, the child's body was found. In 1936, Bruno Hauptmann was tried, convicted, and executed. Case closed. But something didn't sit right. Hauptmann always insisted he was innocent, that the money in his possession had been given to him by a dying friend, a man named Isidor Fisch. The authorities dismissed it. Fisch had died of tuberculosis in Germany in 1934. Dead men make easy scapegoats. Then, in 2008, inside a crumbling house in the Bronx, a crew tearing down plaster walls found something strange, a hollow cavity hidden between beams. Inside, wrapped in crumbling cloth, was a diary. It was written in German, and the name on the first page? Isidor Fisch. The entries spanned late 1931 through early 1934. At first they seemed cryptic, mentions of a plan, a job, the package. But one line, dated March 2, 1932, the day after the kidnapping, stood out. It is done. The package is secured. H knows nothing. He must never know. Later entries revealed paranoia, fear of being watched, anger that H, presumably Hauptmann, was asking too many questions. Fisch planned to flee to Germany. He did. His final entry, dated just weeks before his death: I am dying, and the money is still with H. I cannot retrieve it without exposing everything. The child's death is on my conscience alone. H truly knew nothing until I left the box with him. The diary also contained a crude hand-drawn map. Scribbled in German were notes matching the Lindbergh property layout. It was evidence Hauptmann's defense had never seen. Experts authenticated the diary. The handwriting matched Fisch's immigration and business documents. The ink and paper were consistent with the early 1930s. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Hauptmann wasn't entirely innocent. He held ransom money. But if Fisch was the true kidnapper and Hauptmann didn't know until after the fact, then the state had executed a man guilty of possession, not murder. It also reframed Fisch, not as a shadowy footnote, but as the architect of a tragedy, one who used a dying breath to seal another man's fate. Despite the revelations, courts declined to reopen the case. The Lindbergh family refused to revisit the pain. The verdict stood, but the diary spoke. It revealed a man consumed by guilt, hiding behind the lie of another. It proved the official version was incomplete, and it left behind one more chilling possibility: that the crime of the century had not just been a kidnapping, but a misdirected execution. Justice, blindfolded, holding the wrong man's name. How often do we close the book too soon, leaving the truth folded between pages no one bothered to read? What if the man who vanished into the sky left a trail not in the clouds, but in ink? November 24, 1971. A man using the name Dan Cooper hijacks a Boeing 727, demands $200,000 in cash, and parachutes into the night over the forests of Washington state. No one sees him land. No one finds a body. No one knows what happened next. D.B. Cooper becomes a legend. Dozens of theories. No answers. The only physical trace: a few $1,000s in decayed bills found years later on the banks of the Columbia River by a boy digging in the sand. Until 2016, when a man in Oregon cleaned out his late uncle's storage unit and found a box that didn't belong: old camping gear, skydiving equipment, and at the bottom, a weathered journal. The first entry was dated November 25, 1971, the day after the hijacking. I am alive, barely. The landing was harder than I prepared for. Left leg broken. Several ribs cracked. Lost the bag in the woods. He never mentioned the hijacking directly, never used the name Cooper. But every detail, dates, injuries, terrain, matched what investigators had long speculated. Over the next few entries, the author described hiding in dense wilderness, evading helicopters, wading in freezing creeks to escape dogs. He buried the money, marked the spot with coordinates, written in a personal code no one has yet fully cracked. Weeks later, an entry reads, "Recovered what I could, much of it ruined. Mold, water, maybe 30% usable. Grand plan became a crawl through hell for a few thousand." Then silence. The entries shifted into ordinary life. No more mentions of escape, money, or fear. Just quiet reflections. Work, family, bills. The journal bore no name, but it was signed once, briefly, in an early entry. Forensic analysis compared the handwriting to known samples from Cooper suspects. One stood out, Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr., arrested for a similar hijacking in 1972. But the match was never definitive. The journal offered something else, a reason why Cooper was never found. Not because he vanished forever, but because he lived, quietly, off the radar, bearing the weight of a plan that almost failed. The 1980 discovery of waterlogged bills on the Columbia River. It matched the journal's story. Some money, buried and ruined. A loss disguised as mystery. The FBI reopened the case in 2016, briefly, then closed it again when the journal couldn't conclusively prove its author's identity. But the mystery had already changed. It was no longer, did Cooper survive? Now it was. Who wrote this, and why hide for so long? Sometimes the truth doesn't wear a mask. It wears silence. It grows old. It leaves behind just enough for someone else to follow, but not enough to reach the end. What if Cooper wasn't just a man who jumped from a plane, but a man who spent the rest of his life outrunning the one moment that defined him? And what if he tried, one last time, to leave a map back to who he really was? What if the most chilling part of a mystery wasn't how people died, but why they ran? February 1959. 9 experienced hikers set out into Russia's Ural Mountains. They never returned. When searchers found the Dyatlov group's tent weeks later, it had been slashed open from the inside. Their bodies were scattered in the snow, some nearly naked despite sub-zero temperatures. Several had strange internal injuries, fractured skulls, broken ribs, but no signs of struggle. The Soviet report concluded vaguely, an unknown compelling force. Speculation filled the silence. Avalanche? Military testing? UFOs? Then, in 2019, a film crew searching the area near the old campsite uncovered a metal canister buried in snow and debris. Inside, wrapped in decaying waterproof cloth, were several pages, barely legible, of a handwritten diary. The name scrawled at the top, Semyon Zolotaryov, one of the victims. Zolotaryov had already puzzled investigators. He was older than the rest, a last-minute addition to the group, and his body had shown some of the worst injuries. The official group diary recovered in 1959 made little mention of him, but this was his personal journal, hidden, secret, and what it described changed everything. The final entries detail the evening of February 1st. Zolotaryov writes of waking up suddenly, struggling to breathe. Others were stirring too, coughing, panicked. He describes pressure in the head, burning lungs, air thick and wrong. They fled the tent not because something attacked from outside, but because something inside was killing them. The group had been using a stove for warmth. If snow blocked the ventilation, carbon monoxide could have filled the tent, silent, odorless, lethal. Zolotaryov's words, confusion, breathlessness, disorientation, matched the symptoms. The stove's heat may have saved them from freezing, but doomed them through poison. His handwriting grows erratic. He describes the group's confusion, their attempts to build a fire, some trying to return to the tent, only to collapse. He writes of his own blurred thoughts, his growing certainty that the very thing keeping them warm had betrayed them. The final entry is devastating. We are dying from our own warmth. The tent saved us, and it killed us. When experts re-examined the case with this new evidence, they found that the internal injuries, so long a source of speculation, could have come from falls on ice-covered rocks. Disoriented and desperate, some had stumbled into ravines, others had stripped off clothing, a paradoxical response to hypothermia. Zolotaryov had written through his own unraveling. His last act was not to survive, but to explain. The Russian authorities later closed the case again, attributing the deaths to a combination of avalanche and hypothermia. But the diary, this fragment of a man's final clarity, tells a deeper story. Not of a sudden terror, but of a slow, invisible danger, one that crept into their lungs as they slept. What if the force that drove them out wasn't unknown, but misunderstood? Not a monster in the snow, but a trick of warmth in a place that punishes it. And what does it mean that we look to the skies for answers when all along the truth may have been right there, in the dying breath of a man who tried to leave a message in the frost? What if the last coordinates of a vanished flight weren't lost at sea, but locked in a drawer, misfiled for 77 years? July 2nd, 1937. Amelia Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan disappear over the Pacific while attempting to circumnavigate the globe. No wreckage, no distress signal, no confirmed crash site. Just one final radio transmission. We are running north and south. The world searched. Nothing. Theories flourished. She crashed and sank. She was captured by the Japanese. She lived under an assumed name. But no one knew. Then, in 2014, a Smithsonian archivist cataloging aviation materials stumbled upon a folder labeled Training Materials, Noonan. Inside, among charts and weather logs, was a worn navigation notebook. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Noonan's. And it wasn't training material. It was the real navigation log from their final flight. The last entries detailed their approach to Howland Island, the tiny speck in the Pacific they were aiming for. Noonan's notes show rising frustration, unexpected headwinds, drifting off course, fuel running low. Cannot maintain bearing, wind stronger than forecast, adjusting course, but correction may be impossible. Then came the line that changed everything. If Howland not sighted by 9:45, proceed to Phoenix Group. One of those islands? Nikumaroro, a desolate atoll 350 miles southeast of Howland, long suspected by some as a possible landing site, but never confirmed. Noonan's log suggested they had a plan, and it put them near Nikumaroro at exactly the right time. Other clues suddenly made sense. Artifacts found on the island decades earlier, a woman's shoe, pieces of aircraft aluminum, and bones of a European female, once dismissed, now aligned with Noonan's calculations. Most haunting was Earhart's final radio message. We are on the line 157-337, running north and south. A phrase that had puzzled experts for decades. But in Noonan's log, that line was part of their search pattern. When they couldn't see Howland, they planned to fly along that line, north and south, hoping to spot it visually. When that failed, they would turn toward the Phoenix Islands. They did everything right. They just missed by miles. The log, yellowed and fragile, had been misfiled for decades. Probably sent ahead for safekeeping. Never reunited with the plane or the people who needed it most. It didn't provide a crash site, but it gave something else. Clarity. Fred Noonan wasn't lost. He navigated with precision, adapted to the wind, and planned for failure. Amelia Earhart wasn't reckless. She followed the plan, executed the backup, and kept flying when the world stopped listening. And in a cabinet half a world away, the story waited, quiet, patient, almost forgotten. What if the mystery of Earhart's disappearance was never a mystery at all? What if we just hadn't opened the right drawer? What if the truth about a mass death was written not in manifestos or speeches, but in the secret words of someone who pretended to sleep through it? November 18, 1978, Jonestown, Guyana. Over 900 members of the People's Temple lay dead in a remote jungle settlement. The official story? Mass suicide, drinking cyanide-laced Flavor Aid under the orders of cult leader Jim Jones. But not everyone died. One survivor, Hyacinth Thrash, an elderly woman, told authorities she had slept through the night of death. When she awoke, the camp was silent. Bodies surrounded her. That was the story she told. And everyone believed her. Until 2011, when her grandniece found a journal hidden in a hollowed-out Bible, years after Hyacinth's death. She hadn't slept through it. She had watched. The journal begins like a confession. Hyacinth describes being awake in her cabin when the loudspeakers crackled to life. Jim Jones, calm and commanding, calling everyone to the pavilion. She looked through her window. Hundreds lined up. The first to drink were his most devoted followers. They went willingly. But then, resistance. Screaming, children crying, people refusing, armed guards stepping in. They didn't drink willingly, she wrote. They were made to. Parents were forced to poison their own babies, then themselves. The journal is raw, desperate. Her hand trembled on the page, but the words burned. She wrote of hiding beneath her bed, biting her knuckles to stay silent. She saw guards patrol the cabins, ensuring no one had escaped. She described hearing 3 people flee into the jungle, then gunshots. I was too scared to run, too scared to speak, so I chose silence. And I lived. She admitted why she lied. I told them I was asleep. If I told the truth, they'd say I helped. Or worse, they'd silence me, too. For decades, her account was overlooked. Her interviews, calm and forgetful. But her journal told another story. This was not suicide. It was murder, disguised as devotion. Historians authenticated the journal. The handwriting matched Hyacinth's known documents. Details she described, locations of bodies, sequence of events, aligned with forensic evidence. Her version supported what other survivors had whispered for years but lacked the courage or proof to declare. Most chillingly, she wrote that Jim Jones was alive for nearly the entire ordeal, directing, overseeing, commanding. He died only after ensuring that nearly everyone else had. The journal reframed Jonestown. Not a collective leap of faith, but a forced descent into death. Not a tragedy of belief, but an atrocity of control. Hyacinth died in 1995. She never spoke of the journal, but she left it hidden, knowing someday someone would read it. And when they did, the official story cracked. What if survival means not speaking, but writing? What if the most powerful truth is the one you don't dare say out loud, but still find a way to tell? What if an escape deemed impossible wasn't just pulled off, but documented, hidden inside the very raft that carried them away? June 11, 1962. Alcatraz, America's most secure prison. 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, vanish from their cells. A makeshift raft, cold, dark water, and then nothing. Authorities claim they drowned. The currents were too strong, the water too cold. Case closed. But in 2013, during a routine cleanup on Angel Island, a park ranger found a decayed section of rubberized material, part of a raincoat raft. Sewn into its lining, hidden beneath layers of adhesive, was a sealed pocket. Inside, a notebook. Pages soaked, faded, but not gone. The handwriting matched Frank Morris. The first entry, dated June 12, 1962. We made it, barely. Angel Island, freezing. Clarence in bad shape. John trying to keep fire going. Rest tonight. Move tomorrow. He described what happened after the escape, something no one had ever been able to prove. They had reached land. The journal details their stay on Angel Island, hiding during daylight, recovering from hypothermia. Clarence too weak to continue. Frank and John left him hidden, vowing to send help. Then they swam again, this time to the Marin County shore. They stole a car, drove north, slept in barns. One entry, dated June 14th. John can't breathe. Ribs may be broken. Left him near Healdsburg Farm. Said I'd come back. I have to. That was the last legible entry. The raft section had drifted for decades, finally returning to shore more than 50 years later. A physical message in a bottle. The FBI reopened the case briefly. A farmer near Healdsburg recalled his father reporting a stolen car and missing clothes in June 1962. Another neighbor remembered seeing two injured men walking the highway. It was dismissed at the time. Now it matched the journal. Handwriting experts confirmed Morris had likely written the entries. The notebook's materials were consistent with prison-issue supplies from the 1960s. It wasn't proof of survival, but it was proof they had made it farther than anyone thought. It also explained why no bodies were found. They didn't die in the water. They lived. At least for a while. One Christmas card, sent to the Anglin family in 2013, had claimed they were alive in South America. The FBI had dismissed it. But now, with Morris's words in hand, the card seemed less like a hoax and more like a whisper from men who had vanished into myth. The official position remains unchanged, presumed drowned, but the journal tells another story, of three men who spent years planning their escape, who sewed a raft from raincoats, crafted fake heads from soap and paper, and wrote down their final steps in case no one ever believed them. Frank Morris didn't write to gloat. He wrote to be remembered. What if the difference between legend and history is a few wet pages, sealed into rubber, drifting quietly until someone is finally willing to believe? What if the perfect escape was real, and the proof was always floating just out of reach? What if the largest explosion of the 20th century wasn't fully explained by science, but buried by silence? June 30th, 1908. A fireball explodes over the Tunguska River in Siberia, flattening 770 square miles of forest. No crater, no fragments, just scorched earth and leveled trees. The cause, officially an asteroid or comet airburst. But for decades, the truth felt incomplete. Witnesses reported glowing skies. Compass needles spun. Some said the trees had been crystallized. In 2021, nearly a century after the first scientific expedition to the site, a lost diary surfaced, written by the man who led that expedition, Russian mineralogist Leonid Kulik. Kulik's official reports were careful, methodical. But this diary, kept separate and never published, told a different story. He described reaching the blast zone in 1927 and finding more than flattened trees. Some areas were untouched, but coated in a glassy residue, like melted sand. Others caused his team's compasses to fail. Metal tools heated unexpectedly in their hands. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Then came the fragments, small pieces of metal lighter than aluminum, cold to the touch even in sunlight. When handled for long, Kulik wrote, they caused headaches, nausea, and bleeding from the nose, radiation sickness. But in 1927, he didn't have the language or tools to confirm it. He sent the samples to Moscow. Days later, he was ordered to stop. Do not collect more. Do not analyze further. Focus on blast effects only. That was the official command. In the diary, Kulik raged. Science loses to politics. Truth is buried in the forest. Two of his team members fell ill. One never recovered. Kulik suspected the fragments were dangerous, radioactive even, but the equipment to test them didn't exist. The diary's final entry is chilling. We are ordered to leave. The samples are gone. Whatever fell here, Moscow does not want us to know what it was. The diary remained hidden for nearly a century, buried in a mislabeled archive at the Russian Academy of Sciences. When researchers read it, they began to ask new questions. In 2023, a box labeled Kulik, Tunguska, 1927, was found in a restricted archive. Inside, metallic fragments, just as Kulik described. Modern testing revealed isotopic ratios not found on Earth. The metal had been exposed to extreme pressures and heat. It wasn't from a known satellite, meteorite, or aircraft. Its origins remain undetermined. Kulik was right. The evidence existed. It had just been buried. Whether the Tunguska object was a comet, asteroid, or something stranger, his diary gave scientists a roadmap back to physical proof. He wrote, knowing he might be silenced. He wrote because even when orders told him not to see, he had already seen too much. What if the explosion wasn't the end of the mystery, but the beginning? What if sometimes the most dangerous discovery is not what lies in the crater, but what someone tried to keep from being unearthed? What if the final words of a missing woman were hidden not in the wreckage, but in the math? Amelia Earhart, July 2nd, 1937. Somewhere over the Pacific, her voice crackled over the radio, and then was gone. No wreckage was ever confirmed. No trace of her or her navigator, Fred Noonan. For decades, theories collided. She sank. She crashed. She was captured. She lived in secret. Then came 2014 and the rediscovery of something long misfiled, quietly sitting in a Smithsonian archive. A thin, weathered notebook labeled Training Materials, Noonan. But inside was something else entirely. Noonan's actual navigation log. Not a copy, not a draft. The real thing, his working notes from the last leg of their fateful flight. The entries end around 8 a.m., roughly 2 hours before Earhart's final transmission. Noonan had been tracking headwinds stronger than forecast. Frustration filled the margins, cannot hold bearing, drift severe, adjusting course, fuel margin decreasing. Then, beneath a smudge of pencil and sweat-stained paper, if Howland not sighted by 9:45, proceed southeast to Phoenix Group. One island in that group had long drawn attention. Nikumaroro, uninhabited, flat, isolated. Long suspected, but never confirmed, as a possible landing site. Now, Noonan's own handwriting supported it. They had a backup plan. His coordinates placed them within 30 miles of Nikumaroro around the time radio contact ceased, and they matched the direction Earhart's final words described. We are running north and south, a north-south search pattern, looking, hoping, flying blind. The log didn't end with panic. It ended with a decision. Later studies revisited artifacts found on Nikumaroro, a woman's shoe, aircraft debris, a bone fragment. All previously dismissed, now reevaluated through Noonan's plotted course. And suddenly it all aligned. They didn't vanish without a trace. They followed the plan. They missed Howland by miles, adjusted as trained, and likely landed on a flat coral reef, their fate sealed not by incompetence, but by precision that still couldn't defeat misfortune. The log also revealed why their radio couldn't save them. Their direction-finding gear wasn't functioning. They could transmit but not triangulate. They were flying blind into a vast blue silence. And Noonan knew it. His final log thought, we proceed with hope but little fuel. If we miss Phoenix, there is no next. No panic, no despair, just the cold arithmetic of a man who had done everything right and knew it might not be enough. The log had been misfiled in 1939, likely sent ahead of the final flight for safekeeping, never reunited with the flight that never returned. It didn't solve everything, but it solved the biggest question. They didn't disappear randomly. They aimed. They adjusted. They survived, briefly. What if the mystery was never about where they went? What if it was about what we missed, until we finally read the numbers written in fading pencil by a man determined to navigate to the very end. What if the final chapter of a legend wasn't lost at sea, in the snow, or in archives, but sewn into the very fabric of what helped him escape? June 1962. 3 men vanish from Alcatraz. Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. A raft, some dummy heads, and a hole in the back of their cells. The official story was quick. They drowned. Too cold. Too far. Too impossible. But in 2013, during a routine beach cleanup on Angel Island, across the bay from Alcatraz, a ranger found something half buried in sand. A piece of a makeshift raft. Rubberized raincoat material. Torn but intact. Inside one of the raft's sealed seams, sewn shut, was a waterproof packet. And inside it, pages. Water-stained, fragile, but readable. A journal. The handwriting matched Frank Morris. The dates were clear. June 12th to June 14th, 1962, the 3 days immediately following the escape. We made it to Angel, hypothermic. Clarence barely conscious. John and I made fire. No sign of patrols. They had survived the crossing. This wasn't a myth or speculation. Morris's words confirmed what authorities had always denied. They made it farther than anyone believed. Clarence, according to Morris, was too weak to continue. He remained hidden on Angel Island. Morris and John swam again, this time across Raccoon Strait to Marin County. We reached the farm near Healdsburg, Morris wrote. Stole clothes, a car. No one saw. No one will. The entries grow sparse. One, dated June 14th, reads, John can't breathe. Think ribs broken. Left him with a blanket and cash. Said I'd come back. But there are no later entries, no records of Morris, no sightings, just silence. And this journal. The FBI re-interviewed residents of Healdsburg. One remembered her father reporting stolen work clothes that week. Another remembered 2 injured men walking north on Highway 101. Until now, such accounts had been brushed off. But with Morris's journal, they found their context. And what of Clarence? He was never found. But the raft piece, discovered decades later, had washed back near Angel Island, perhaps carried by the current or left behind during a second attempt. One page in the journal ends mid-sentence. Clarence, if you're reading this someday, it never finishes. What does it mean to escape? Is it the act of breaking free or the life lived after? We still don't know how long any of them survived. There were whispers, photos in Brazil, postcards sent home, but none proven. The journal didn't confirm their fate, but it did rewrite the ending. They weren't swept away by the tide in the night. They walked among us for a day, a week, maybe longer. And they wrote it down. What if history's clean conclusions, they drowned, they disappeared, are more comfortable than true? And what if the truth is messier, floating just offshore, waiting to be read by someone who still believes in impossible escapes? What if the most enduring truths in history weren't carved in stone, but scribbled in notebooks no one was supposed to read? 10 diaries, 10 voices speaking across time, across ice, across silence. Each written in secrecy or desperation, by people who understood something that no one else did or dared to say. A sailor dying slowly in the Arctic, watching his comrades collapse under invisible poison and writing the truth before the ice took him. A woman hiding in a Russian closet, counting the bodies of a royal family and quietly surviving history's greatest erasure. A man who may have been Jack the Ripper, confessing not to a crowd, but to a journal that would vanish into a drawer. A scapegoat left to hang for a crime someone else planned and recorded. A ghost in the sky, D.B. Cooper, who vanished with a parachute and left behind the one thing no one expected, a diary of regrets. From the frozen lungs of Dyatlov Pass to the calculated steps of Fred Noonan's final course. From Hyacinth Thrash's trembling hand as she wrote what she could never say, to Frank Morris slipping his words inside the raft that carried him into myth, from a century-old explosion in Siberia whose answers were buried not by trees but by politics, to a child's death in New Jersey obscured by a courtroom and a lie. All of them shared one belief, that truth mattered, even if it couldn't be told out loud. Each diary solved a mystery once thought impenetrable, not with dramatic revelations, but with careful witness. A sentence here, a coordinate there, a fragment of thought frozen in time. And yet nearly every one was ignored when first discovered, misfiled, dismissed, hidden again by fear, by bureaucracy, by disbelief. What does that say about us? That we chase the dramatic, the mythical, the impossible, while the truth sits quietly in a box in someone's attic? How many more lie waiting? In desk drawers, in forgotten basements, in old jacket linings and family Bibles, notebooks that hold the real ending to stories we thought had already closed. History is not complete. The record is never final, and the dead are not always silent. If we listen, really listen, we may still hear them speak. Because sometimes the most powerful voice isn't the loudest. It's the one that wrote, knowing no one might ever read it, but hoping someone someday would. And now we have. What will we do with what they've left behind?